Welcome to Stillspeakpod. This is part 2 of revisiting the body camera footage from the August 12th incident between Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie. And I started it a few days ago with part 1, and in a twist of events, yesterday we actually got new body cam footage from a different officer, but the same incident. And it's definitely a different view. This new one was really heartbreaking. It was very hard to watch, and I briefly mentioned it at the end of my video yesterday. I don't want to go out of order, so I'm going to pick up where I left off in part 1 with the original body cam footage, and then depending on time and how much needs to be covered, I may continue with the new one in this episode, or I might do it in the next one in its own video as a part 3. And I do want you to listen carefully to the entire video before coming at me, because I want to make clear here that I am not blaming the officers for what ultimately happened to Gabby 2 weeks later. So don't come at me listening to only 10 minutes of this and then, leaving a nasty comment or something without listening to it all the way through. And I do want you to keep in mind that there are still 1 or I think 2 officers whose body cam footage we have not gotten yet. We have to see. And you're also going to want to listen carefully, because this may get confusing. And there's going to be 2 officers that I'm talking about the most. One I'm going to refer to as the main officer. He was the one that was kind of trying to handle the situation. And the second one is I'm going to refer to him as the bearded officer, because in the footage, he's the one with a beard. And he's got sunglasses on. He's a bigger guy. And so it's just easier to call him bearded. I believe his name is Eric. But just to make this easiest, when you're watching the body cam footage, he's the one with the beard, okay? So we left off in part 1 at the point that 2 officers, the main officer and the bearded one, are off to the side discussing how to handle the situation. And I expressed to you that I was greatly bothered because the bearded officer was telling the main officer that he spoke with one of the witnesses on the phone. And he said these words, and you have to listen carefully to this. He said, "I don't know what Brian is saying, but it sounds like he's saying that what she's saying and the witness is saying." Yeah, that's what he said. So, one more time. "I don't know what Brian is saying, but sounds like he's saying what she's saying and the witness is saying." Okay, bro, so I was expressing to you in part 1 like this doesn't make any sense. You're saying you don't know what he's saying, but then you're saying it sounds like he's saying. Do you know what he's saying, or you don't know what he's saying? And, and I expressed this bother with him that, like, okay, so you don't know what he's saying, or you don't know all of what he said. And this matters because ultimately this is the one who came to the conclusion that Gabby was the aggressor. And if you don't know what Brian's even saying, how do you even come to that? But we're going to get there. And the second thing that annoyed me was that Brian had actually told the main officer, he said it several different ways, that he basically was locking the van because he was like, let's take a walk, you go this way, I go that way, we'll separate, take a breather, He was making it seem like he locked them both out of the van, and he was trying to get things calm by saying, like, let's go for a walk. But this officer, the bearded one, after he spoke with the witness, was saying that the witness was saying that Brian was in the van. And Gabby was trying to get in the van, okay? And was trying to get over at him. So basically she was clawing at him, which, come on. If you guys are fighting and he gets in the van and he's attempting to lock you out of this van, you, of course, are going to get worried that he's about to leave you there, right? So if you get a chance to get in the van, you're going to claw your way in, right? I'd go Wolverine on his ass too, right? Like, let me in the freaking van, especially the fact that it was her van. Are you kidding me? So, this right here is a conflict between Brian saying that, you know, basically he wanted them to go for a walk, and this witness saying that, you know, she was clawing her way in over him. So this right here alone should have sparked even more inquiry from Brian to clarify that. Because this bearded officer who's relaying what the witness said about her clawing into the van is the same one who's claiming that he didn't know what Brian was saying, but it sounded like Brian was saying the same thing as the female and the witness, when in reality that's not true, right? Because he's saying, the witness is saying that he was clawing her way into the van. Brian was saying go for a walk, but that's not what happened. So these two officers, main officer and bearded one, are talking. And the main officer then shared that he witnessed the couple hitting the curb when he was ready to pull them over. And the bearded officer was like, well, what did he say happened? Meaning Brian. So again, this officer is showing us that he really didn't know what Brian had been saying up to that point. Because he had to ask this main officer what was Brian's explanation for hitting the curb. So the main officer explains, well, Gabby said that she, hit him. And Brian said that she grabbed the wheel. And the bearded officer said, well, it sounds legit. Because if I'm driving, I'm holding the wheel, and someone's hitting my arm, basically he was saying it would jerk the steering wheel. And he didn't use those exact words, but I'm giving you the basic summary because he uses a lot of hand and arm gestures to demonstrate what he's trying to say. But Brian actually said that she grabbed the steering wheel. He didn't say that while she was hitting with me, my arm jerked and the steering wheel went off to the side. And we also can't forget that Brian was speeding, because we talked about in part 1, the officer said, well, did she take over the pedal too because you were speeding? So this whole idea that, she was to blame for why this hit this curb is still, the verdict is still out here. Because, she wasn't making him drive 45 miles an hour in a 15. But then this officer, so he describes, like, okay, that makes sense, he's driving, she hits his arm comes down, he jerks the wheel, okay, whatever. But then he says, I'm sure it was a little bit of both, and usually the truth is somewhere in between. He's probably, listen carefully, he's probably trying to not say he hit her because he probably does not want to be charged with assault. And when I heard this, I had to go back and rewind it like 4 times. I'm looking at the caption, I'm listening to things, I'm like, what is he saying? Okay, so this particular bearded officer really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to this whole video. He really doesn't. He's kind of, I don't know, I can't kind of put my finger on what his issue was, but he just didn't make a whole lot of sense. And he also used a lot of probably, sounds like, seems like, a lot of assumptions he made, like a lot of guessing. And again, he said he didn't know what Brian was saying, but then he said it sounded like what he's saying, which doesn't make any sense. Because he clearly doesn't know what Brian had said at this point, because he didn't even know what Brian said about hitting the curb. Yet, at this point, he's already come to the conclusion that Gabby was the aggressor, and he was guiding the main officer on how to handle the fact that she was the main aggressor, the female, not the male. So I'm like, okay, dude, you don't even know what Brian's saying, and you already came to this conclusion. Like, you only talked to him for like a minute, but you didn't hear all the other things he was saying, so why is it you're the one who gets to decide that she's the main aggressor if you don't even have Brian's side of the story, right? Because you just admitted you didn't know all of it. But anyways, and to add to that, mind you, he only talked to one witness in the new body cam footage, because I already reviewed it. We never see him call the second witness, which that second witness is the one who said that Brian was hitting and slapping her. So again, how is he coming to the conclusion that she's the aggressor if, one, he didn't even fully speak with Brian or knew all that Brian was saying at this point, and he didn't speak to the witness who said that he was hitting and slapping her? So you're missing two main individuals in this incident whose story you don't even have, but you already came to the conclusion that Gabby was the aggressor because she's the one who owned up and said that she was the one who hit him. Right? Okay. But let me go back to the part that I had to rewind 4 times and listen and read the caption to make sure that I wasn't, misunderstanding what he was trying to say. Let me repeat it again slowly. He said, he's probably trying not to say he hit her because he probably doesn't want her charged with assault. Come again? Shouldn't he have said he probably doesn't want to say she was hitting him because he didn't want her charged with assault? Or is it on the flip side and he meant he probably doesn't want to say he was hitting her because he doesn't want to go to jail? We don't know. His first sentence, what he actually said, doesn't make any sense. But if it's the second one, well, duh, who would admit that they hit the female? Like, as far as a male's concerned, I know Gabby said that she did. I'm not sure that I believe her. And if she did hit her, I think it was just in a moment of desperation because she thought he was leaving her and taking the van. That being said, that's just my opinion. Somebody who's being abused is often the one to take blame for some things. So him saying like, well, if he really meant that he didn't want to say that he hit her because he doesn't want to go to jail, like, in my mind I'm thinking, well, duh, because most males are not going to admit they hit the female. I mean, I'm sure some do, but isn't it typically normal to deny that you did something like that? I think so. But again, this whole sentence that he said doesn't make any sense. And he probably did mean that he didn't want to say he hit her because he probably doesn't want her charged. Because why would she be charged if he hit her? That doesn't make any sense. Do you get what I'm saying here? So I think he just mixed up his words, but I just had to point it out because I'm like, what is this dude even saying, or does he even believe in what he's saying? Because I have to think that you actually don't even believe in what you're saying if you can't even fully say that what you're trying to say clearly, because you're mixing up the he and her, right? Because if you're trying to say that he doesn't want to say that she hit him because he doesn't want her charged, that makes sense. But to say he doesn't want to admit that he hit her because he doesn't want her charged, that makes no sense, because she wouldn't be charged if he hit her. I know, I just completely lost you, didn't I? Right? I probably did, because it's really confusing, but this guy is confusing. It's not my fault. Blame him. So anyways, so if he really meant that Brian didn't want to say that Gabby hit him because he didn't want her charged, if that's what he was really trying to say, which probably was the case and he just said it wrong, the thing is that Brian did say Gabby hit him. He did not hide what she did. He also said she grabbed the steering wheel. So if the officer had misspoke and what he really meant was that Brian didn't want to say that she hit him so she wouldn't be charged, that's actually not backed up by fact, because he did openly admit that she hit him and grabbed the wheel. So, again, this shows that this officer had no idea what Brian was saying. This is now the third example that this officer who deemed Gabby the aggressor really had no idea what was going on. He only had like a basic understanding. And he was the one that came on the scene a little bit later. He's the one that I read to you the incident report where he talked about how he heard on the radio that other officers were going to find the van, and he was driving past the Moonflower, and he decided to stop there to see if there was any witnesses because he had to pass it anyway on the way, and so he figured he would just stop. And when he stopped, he saw a witness, got a name and a number, and then he went to this incident. So he kind of came on the scene a little bit later. And again, obviously, we know he didn't speak to the second witness, and we know that he really didn't have a good understanding of what Brian was saying, but he still kind of interjected himself into this incident without knowing those details or speaking to those people, and just, you know, proclaimed that Gabby was the aggressor because she openly admitted to it. So, and then this whole idea that he wouldn't want to tell the officers that she hit him because he didn't want her charged, so he said that she grabbed the steering wheel, as if grabbing the steering wheel is, saying that she grabbed the steering wheel is any better than her hitting him. Because, I mean, I gotta beg to differ here. I mean, grabbing a steering wheel is actually far more concerning and much more dangerous than this 110-pound girl hitting or slapping her fiance boyfriend's arm. I mean, she could have, if that is what happened and she grabbed the wheel, she could have killed him, herself, or others on the road if she grabbed that wheel. So to like say like, you know, well, you know, he's not saying that she hit her, that she hit him, excuse me, because he doesn't want her charged, but you know that Brian said that she grabbed the wheel. That just shows you that Brian really doesn't care about throwing her under the bus, because he openly admitted that she grabbed the wheel. Oh, I hope you're following me here. Trust me, this was not easy to even put my thoughts together and make up notes, because I'm like, all right, how am I going to make this as non-confusing as possible? But you might have to watch this twice, but you'll get it. And, you know, when you go back and watch the body cam footage, you'll actually see what I'm talking about. And I suggest you put on closed caption because it's super helpful. Even though that can be iffy at times, it's definitely more helpful than not. And the issue is in that video is that they're on a road, and so it's so freaking loud. All the background sound is so loud, and so there's parts that are so hard to hear, so that's when the closed caption really helps out. And anyway, so I mentioned that he says a lot of probably, a lot of supposedly, or sounds like, and things like that. And I use those words. I use probably, supposedly, allegedly, sounds like, blah, blah, blah on this channel when we're speculating about a case or a situation. But you're really, you know, in a situation like this, while you are also kind of speculating and trying to get to the bottom of something and following your gut of what you saw or what you're being told, in my opinion, there should first, before doing that, make an attempt to know the facts and have all the stories from all the parties before then speculating and coming to a conclusion based on everything that was told to you and how everybody described it, how their behavior is, etc. Me using those words on this channel is different than officers obviously doing it in the field where there's lives that could be on the line. So I felt like this particular officer was just making a lot of guesses, a lot of assumptions, and using very, ass-covering words like sounds like, probably, supposedly, blah, blah, blah. And then they say, in a nutshell, basically that they're going to have to separate them. They're going to have to put a no contact order in place and give Gabby a citation, how they can't treat this differently because it's, female on male violence, which I do agree with that, right? Because it's not females that can only be abused. Males can be abused too. I don't think Brian Laundrie was an abused boyfriend by any means, personally. That's my opinion. But I have known in other cases where a male was absolutely abused, and abuse comes in all forms: emotional, mental, financial, physical, right? So I agree with that. And there are females who are bigger than the males, stronger than the males, and extremely aggressive, like where they actually use weapons like knives or try to hit their boyfriends with a car. I mean, that's a different situation than this 110-pound girl. I mean, she was a string bean. She really was. And, hitting or slapping him, I mean, she wasn't going to do much damage to him. Let's be real. I mean, come on. Scratches? Yeah. But that could have just been happening because she was trying to get in the van, not because she was actually like a cat. And like Brian tried claiming that her phone caused the scratches, and I said in the other video, I'm really not sure how a phone causes scratches, so that can't be it, Brian, but nice try. They started to walk over to Brian, and they say, let's talk to him first. And this same officer is the one with the beard who deemed Gabby the aggressor. He then asks, is his name Brian? And the main officer's like, yeah. So at this point, this officer who already deemed Gabby the aggressor didn't even know for sure what Brian's name was. Yeah. So, and let me stop right there and say it again. I'm not blaming these officers for what happened to Gabby 2 weeks later. I also know that I'm looking at this in hindsight. But even when you're looking at something in hindsight, what's odd or what stands out or what you pick up on is things that could have been picked up on in real time, in that moment. And this particular situation with this bearded officer, no offense to him, but I feel that this was completely unfair to not get all the full stories from everybody before coming to a conclusion. Like, you don't even know this guy's name fully for sure, and you already decided who the aggressor was. And that's just, in my opinion, not cool. So they started to explain to Brian that they don't have discretion on domestic assault. It's one of the few things they don't have discretion on. He said, you have injuries, and then he gestured to Brian's face, and then he said that both independent witness, probably the next one we're going to talk to as well, which we haven't talked to yet, so he catches himself because he says both independent witness, probably the next one we're going to talk to as well, which we haven't talked to yet, but the one we did talk to and your own companion had made it clear. Okay, so that was his exact word. So originally he was going to try to say that both the witnesses are saying that he didn't hit her. But then he catches himself and says, well, probably the next one we're going to talk to as well is going to say that, is what he's trying to imply. And then he says, but we haven't talked to him yet. So let me say that again. So he says, both independent witness, probably the next one we're going to talk to as well, which we haven't talked to yet, but the one we did talk to and your own companion had made it clear that she was the primary aggressor and she was striking you, and you haven't admitted to striking her. Well, actually, Mr. Officer Mann, in your footage, it shows that the witness was actually not clear on what actually happened. So why are you saying that he made it clear? Because he doesn't. And we're going to talk about that when we get to the new footage. But pause here for a second. Since when do we need to hear someone admit that they hit somebody? Is it not rather common that a person will not admit to their crime? I mean, right? Deny. No, officer, I didn't hit her. No, I was just trying to get her away from me. She was like, all up in me, and I was like, come on, get away. No, I didn't hit her. No. I mean, isn't that common to deny or downplay and not flat out admit it? So why is he saying, well, you're not admitting to striking her? Well, I mean, do you expect that, is he only guilty if he admits to doing it? I mean, last I checked, that's not usually the case, but whatever. So then he says to Brian, and I've said this before in another video, she did not say you striked her, the witness did not say that you striked her, and you did not say you striked her. So at this point, you're the victim of domestic assault. Which again, for the millionth time, he didn't talk to both witnesses. Okay. And he also didn't get more of the story from Brian after admitting that he didn't know what Brian was saying. When he walked over to Brian, he didn't try then at that point to get the story out of Brian. The other officer had earlier, but this guy did not. He went over and started talking about domestic assault and then was like, oh, hey, by the way, you're the victim of domestic assault, but I don't know what the hell you told the officer. Like, what? Okay. The look on Brian's face when he was told he was the victim of domestic assault, like if a look could tell an entire story, woo-wee. Because he turned from that officer, the bearded officer, and turned to the main officer and immediately smiled and then laughed. And then he says, well, I don't know about that. And then he laughs again. Now, he could have been embarrassed to be considered a victim because he was, the male. He could have also been laughing because he thought they were overreacting and it wasn't like as big of a deal as they were trying to make it seem. Or this reaction was a form of relief. This immediate smile and laugh was that release of that relief because he seemed very nervous up to this point. And so then, they explained to him that they can't treat her differently. And then they posed the idea of them separating so that she doesn't have to go to jail. And Brian says, can I go to jail? And to many, this came across as he wanted to take her place. But given the demeanor of him laughing and smiling, I'm not really quite sure that's what he really meant. He didn't actually seem concerned. And what I mean by that, like, if he had this concern where he had this serious face and he was like, please don't arrest her, can you arrest me instead, that type of way. This was like, can I go to jail? It wasn't like, it didn't come across serious, it was more of like a joke. It made it things kind of awkward and weird because they don't really laugh along with him. And then he leads into this statement to the officer saying, well, I'll take your radio, meaning that he'd take his radio so then they'd have some reason to charge him and then he can go to jail. Again, this was all done in a very joking type of manner when he said that. And the officer explained that, he can get the no contact order dropped the next day and that she would need to attend court online. And then Brian says, I'm not going to pursue anything. That's too much. But I will say, she's my fiance. I love her. Sorry I had to get so public. So I want to get a checklist of things I got to do to get rid of. And at that moment, he's cut off by an officer. And I think he was leading into saying, I need to know how to get rid of this order. So they explained to get rid of the order, and the court appearance and how it would be online, blah, 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 all that stuff. And then Brian randomly says, we're a team, her and I. Sorry about all this again. And Brian was then asked if he had enough money for a hotel, and he actually doesn't answer the officer right away. And then they said, if you do, what we can do is cite her, then give a ride to whatever hotel unless you know somebody in town. And then the other officer goes, I don't want her to go to jail. Brian said, but if she goes to jail, is that that goes down somewhere? Whatever the hell that means, Brian. What is that? What? That was another area that I had to keep rewinding because I'm like, what is he even trying to say here? I have no freaking idea. But that's what he said. So, your guess is good as mine. And then the audio and caption gets all wonky, so you don't really get any more out of him. So I think he may have been trying to say, if she goes to jail, will you get me the info on where she'll be and where I can go get her? But he didn't say it like that, and then the audio got all mixed up. So I'm just making a total guess here. That's where he was going with that. I could be wrong. So the audio picks back up at it being said that if they don't convict her, then it will just show up as being dismissed, but it is going to show up on her criminal history. And a lot who believe that Gabby was the aggressor, like the officers thought, are trying to say that Brian killed her in self-defense. And I had said that this incident had him listed as the victim. I said this in another video, and I said you would think if he accidentally killed her while trying to defend himself, that he would immediately call the police and tell the police, like, hey, we had this incident, 2 weeks ago. It's on record. I was the victim. I had to stay in a hotel. We just got into another fight, and and this is what happened, blah, blah, blah. Because this incident 2 weeks prior would have really backed him up. Because, again, it's all documented, was the victim. So if this was a self-defense type situation, like Gabby was coming at him and he lost his freaking mind, this is the perfect defense. Like, there's defendants out there that wish they had a defense so easy. And he didn't use that. He didn't do that. He didn't call the police if it was a self-defense thing and say, oh my God, we were in Utah 2 weeks ago. You're never going to believe this. And she just came at me again, and whatever. He doesn't have to stay on the phone on a 911 call, but he can tell the officer when they arrive, and he can just be like, oh my God, I was trying to get her off of me, and give like almost the same exact story that would match the story that happened 2 weeks prior. That's all documented. So that makes zero sense that he wouldn't do that. And he was aware it was documented. I mean, it's common sense for one. I mean, everybody knows that the cops are going to document things like that. But they also took pictures of his injuries and their licenses for their files or for their report. So he knew it was on file. That this incident would actually back him up. And they did take pictures of his injuries, but they actually didn't take pictures of her injuries, and she does have a red mark on her right arm. I showed it to you in another video. It's right at the right below your elbow crease on the right arm. She did have a mark on her face, and she did have a mark on her left arm. No, it wasn't her tattoos. Some people were saying it was her tattoos. I saw her tattoos. This was a separate mark besides her tattoos. But they didn't take pictures of any of her marks, which, I think should have been put into the chart since it was still not really fully concrete who was the aggressor. But what are you going to do? Moving on. Maybe because they already deemed him the victim, then they're not going to take pictures of the aggressor's marks. But I don't know. I don't know how that protocol works for that. So then they go on to explain that if he contacted her and she would reply, that she would be the one to get a new charge because the order doesn't restrict him, but it restricts her. So then Brian says, I'm understanding all this. I'm just trying to figure out a way. And then they asked him again if he knows anyone in the area, and he says no. And one of the officers said, I don't think she can take the shelter since she's the aggressor. And then the officers were curious, and they were going to find out if that was possible, which we never actually see them do, even though they said that they were curious and were going to find out. And Brian said, if you give her a citation, can she drive off in the car? And they said, we would give you a drive somewhere. And he's like, did I get my backpack? Can I get my backpack? I got my backpack. And then he turns to go get it. And then again, the audio messes up. And then they ask if she knows how to drive the van and if she has a valid license. And Brian's like, can you drive me to... He said, yeah. And then he said, can you drive me to Delicate Arts? Not sure what that is, but we could probably look it up. And their response was, you're trying to be homeless for the night. And Brian's like, all right, well, I can't talk to her at all. And I've got to do that thing, referring to dropping the order. So I can't go camping. And then the main officer explains that if he goes to Delicate Art, then he needs to make it to Center Street the next day to get that order dropped. And it's a bit of a walk. And so the officer was explaining that he had to be there before noon. And if he didn't get there before noon, then he'd have to wait till Monday. And he couldn't be around her till Monday. Blah, 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 blah. And he says to Brian, like, we're not trying to make this hard for you, but this is written statute and designed to protect victims of domestic assault. And he says, not everybody's the same. This is different. But we have to treat everything the same, blah, blah, blah. And then third officer, the one with the face covering, he had one of those neck masks where you pull it up over your face. It sounded or appeared to be that he asked if Brian, if they had any money, because then Brian replies and says, we have very little money, that is for sure. Which, we now know he took out over $1,000 from a bank card, right? And we assume it's Gabby's because it mentions a PIN number, which he's not going to have a stranger's PIN number, right? He would have Gabby's number. So he's saying, no, they don't have money, that's for sure. So that's interesting. And then also in context of the story, we now know allegedly he went home to Florida August 17th, which was only 5 days later, and we don't know if he flew or drove, but who paid for that? So I'm not really sure that he was being truthful when he said that he didn't have money. I think he just maybe wanted the free hotel. And so then that's how they start talking about getting him a room through Safe Haven. And then Brian's like, I might be sleeping outside in a sleeping bag. Which, is that a big deal, Brian? That's what you've been doing, traveling the country, living out of a van and using a tent. But I don't know why he even bothered saying that. So anyway, the officer was like, no, no, we're going to get you a hotel. So they were really insistent that Brian get a hotel. And then the officer's like, if you wanted to have the van, we don't care. It's up to you. Now, remember, it was her van. If they would have ran the tags, they would have known that. But this officer was acting like it was his, and that it was his choice whether or not she could take this van, but it was hers. And at this point, the main officer, whose body cam it is, walks off to call this hotel and set things up for Brian. He never does ask if the aggressor can get the hotel room, so I don't know why they were acting like they were going to find out, because they never did ask that. And when he gets back, he tells him, Brian, that the guy needed to run to the office and he'd be calling back. And he's like, I'm trying to make this as easy as possible. Brian's like, I really, really appreciate that. And the officer says, I know how rough this stuff can be. I've been married for 5.5 years. To which Brian cracked the hell up at this. He thought that was so funny. Like, ha 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 ha, you know what it's like to be married to a crazy lady. That's how I took it. It was like this, he thought it was so funny. So now Brian takes the conversation back to her anxiety and how her anxiety elevates his anxiety. So he's like, that's why I just gotta, walk away and breathe. Which, again, reminder, he was in the van, allegedly, according to a witness, and she clawed her way in. He claimed that he locked the van so they could take a breather, but I am not believing that. It sounds to me, based on a witness, that he was trying to lock her out of the van and him go in the van, and she might have taken that as he's leaving me, and she was worried, and so she wanted to get in. But anyways, okay, so then an officer escorted Brian to the van to pack a bag, and this was kind of strange because he seemed to be taking like a dang freaking 5 hours to just get a change of clothes. Like, he was the driver's side, the passenger side. He went in the back of the van. It's like, come on, bro. Grab your clothes, grab your phone and charger, wrap it up. Like, what are you doing? What do you need from this van? Like, you're going to be away for, like, it was only going to be, like, a few hours. This incident was about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and you could see her in the morning. It was, like, maybe 12 hours, 13 hours. Come on. And so as Brian's doing that, the bearded officer goes over to Gabby, and with Gabby is the female park officer, and the main officer, whose camera it is, he walks over to these three people. So Gabby, the female park ranger lady, and the bearded officer. And when the main officer walks up, he's telling Gabby, the bearded officer's telling Gabby that he has nobody who is saying that he was aggressively hitting her, and it sounded more like shoving. Last I checked, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the last I checked, shoving is aggressive, especially when you're grabbing someone's mouth to push them away by their face, right? That's rather aggressive, in my opinion. But I guess that's going into semantics, right? So are we like downplaying shoving as it's not aggressive? Because I've always known shoving to be aggressive. Like, even from elementary school, like, your teacher's like, don't shove each other, don't push each other, right? It's aggressive. And it's definitely a triggering thing, because if you're, okay, well, let's begin here. First, if you're telling her to calm down and she's not even really, not calm, that's number one, would piss somebody off. Then you try locking her out of the van, right, and making her feel scared that you're going to leave her. So that's number two. And then as she's trying to claw herself into the van, you're trying to push her away by her face to get her away from the van. So those are all things that could have made this situation 10 times worse than it needed to be, and actually was pushing and triggering Gabby, right? So that's all very aggressive behavior, especially if you're trying to abandon her and leave in this van, right? I'd say that's aggressive, right? It isn't physically aggressive, but you're trying to abandon her, so that's some form of aggression, in my opinion. But again, here's the same bearded officer, right? And he's telling Gabby that he has nobody who is saying that he was aggressively hitting her, and that it sounded more like shoving. Again, for the millionth time, Mr. Officer Man, you didn't talk to the second witness. The second witness is the one who said that he was hitting and slapping her. So why are you telling this girl that she has nobody to back her up and say that he was aggressively hitting her? And not even back up. Hold on, let me fix that. Because Gabby wouldn't even really flat out admit that he hit her. What she did was, in the new footage, you're going to see that she says, well, I hit him first. So she doesn't flat out say, yes, he hit me, but by her saying that I hit him first, she was admitting that he did hit her, but it's because she hit him first. Okay? So now you're telling her, Mr. Officer Man, Beard Officer Man, that there's nobody to back her up. That nobody's saying that he hit her. How do you think that makes Gabby feel? I just want you to imagine. Imagine being scared and terrified, right? Intimidated. You have all these officers and you don't know what to do, right? Because you know that if you out him, right, there's ramifications for that. And you're scared because if you blame yourself, you're worried that you're going to get in trouble, right? And now you have these officers telling you that nobody is supporting this idea that he was hitting her. You'd feel really alone. And you'd feel really isolated, and you'd be really upset. Okay? Because she would want that, feeling of confirmation, so to speak. And what we're going to see, when we're going to discuss in the new footage, you actually see that before he says all this to her, at this point in this footage, earlier, when he first spoke with her and she was showing him how he grabbed her face and hurt her cheek, etc., and all of that, he actually does tell her that multiple witnesses said he was hitting her. And then he went and talked to the one witness, and now he's coming back to her and saying that nobody is saying that he hit her. So she was under the impression that they were saying that, And then he comes back and says they aren't saying that, but in reality, he had only talked to one. He didn't talk to both of them. And I'm going to skip over the rest of this part because, like I said, we're going to be going over this part when we get to talking about the new footage, because in the new footage, this particular part is much more clear, and we get a really good idea of what was being said. And this particular original footage, it's not clear at all. So anyway, then there's a whole part where the main officer walks off and he's still talking to the hotel employee and blah, 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 blah. And when he walks back over to Brian, we actually get a glimpse of the back of the van because the doors were open. And it was a total wreck. I mean, way different than Gabby had presented on Instagram and in videos. And several things to note here. What you see on social media, it can often be fake, right? So that can explain why it was such a total disaster, because that was reality. But we also need to remember they did hit a curb. We didn't see how hard they hit. The officer did gasp, so it seemed pretty severe. And so things could have gone flying. However, if you look closely at the back of that van, and I said this the other day, it looked to be more of a disaster than I would expect from hitting a curb. It just does. And I think there's this possibility here lingering that things were thrown around or at each other at some point during this day in the van while they were arguing. Or it's possible that maybe Brian intentionally was destroying the van because she was complaining, or in his mind nagging him about making a mess, and he wanted to be spiteful or trigger her, push her buttons by just being like, you want to see a real mess? Here, and starts throwing things around. I mean, you've seen that between couples before, right? When you know that somebody's bothered by something, you do it worse to nag them or trigger them, or you do what you know is going to get them pissed. There's a possibility of that too. And then the officer explains to Brian that he needs to take the pictures for his file, and Brian seems hesitant. He almost looked like he was thinking okay, this is a bit much, but okay, take the pictures. And at one point, the female ranger walks over to get Gabby's phone out of the van, and while they did that, the officer that had stayed with Brian to get his stuff out of the van says to the main officer, I was trying to build some consistencies between stories. And this was fascinating because this shows that this particular officer, which is the one that was wearing the neck mask thing, had observed inconsistencies, and that he was attempting to get a clearer picture of what happened. So this kind of backs up my whole thing where I'm saying there's a lot of consistencies here that were overlooked, right? And this officer clearly saw them too. So when he was helping Brian get his stuff from the van, he was probably trying to get the story again to see if he could get some consistency out of him. So then Brian sticks his hands out for the picture, and his hands are actually shaking a great deal when he does this. And then there's a whole bunch of nothing that's really important. And then the officer walks over to the SUV that Gabby was in, and the ranger woman tells him that she had gotten Gabby her cell phone, and she was calling her parents because she was not wanting to be apart from Brian, and she was really upset. Again, for people out there saying if she was abused, she wouldn't have been not wanting to be apart from him, not true. Please educate yourself on abuse. Actually not true. So the next part is also in the new footage, and it's much more clear in that, so I'm going to skip over this part and we'll talk about it when we get to the new footage. So then the several officers meet up, and they're standing between Gabby, who's in the SUV, and Brian, who's at the van with another officer. And again, they're talking about how to handle this. And the bearded officer, the one who's sort of on my nerves, and the one who came to the conclusion, that she was the aggressor before not really knowing everybody's side, says, I'm recording, and he's referring to his body cam, And society and the judges, everybody can judge me for this, but I am looking at a 110-pound female and her fiance who have no means to be separated. He doesn't want to pursue it. She's not a threat to him more than slight abrasions from fingernails at this point. And then the audio cuts off and they have this conversation for maybe 30 seconds where we can't hear anything. Which is interesting timing because he started off that whole little part right there saying, like, I'm recording and I don't care who judges me for saying this, and he goes into this whole thing, so maybe that's why they cut out what he said after that. And then it picks up with them still discussing how to handle it. And I'm really confused because I don't know who this bearded officer is, meaning, is the main officer who was taking care of this incident like in training? Was he new? Was the officer with beard like a leader? Was he higher up in rank than him? Because there's a lot where he kind of comes on scene and he takes control of the situation, and he's the one that deems her the aggressor, and he's the one that is explaining to the other officer what his options were and how he had to handle it. So this kind of tells me, like, either this guy just likes to take control of things, or he was like maybe a different, I don't know what it's called in the law enforcement, but I'm saying rank because my husband was in the military. I don't know if that works the same with law enforcement, but like, was he higher up than him? Is this why he kind of came on the scene and was like guiding the other guy? I don't know. But that's the impression I was getting. So he says to him, well, you could separate them for night. I mean, what's it to you if they meet back up? At least you provided him safety. And if he doesn't have enough sense to stay away, at least you got them separated. Then it'll be on him. And then he continued and said, what can you do is, you know, if they don't listen and we get called again, we'll mess with you. Because, you know, one really does need help. They may not call the police and get help. Basically, you can't make a threat. This is his words, not mine, okay? So what he's basically saying to him is, you can't make a threat to them. Like, you can't say, okay, we're going to let you off this time, but we better not get another call from you, because if we do, then we're going to X, Y, Z. And he's explaining that the reason why you can't do that is because if the next time they really are in a situation where they need help, they may not call the police, which I want to say right here. Now, Gabby didn't die in Utah. She died almost 2 weeks later. But since she was the one deemed the aggressor in this situation, I'd love to see her phone records, because I do have to wonder if her and Brian were having an altercation before she died, that she may not have called the police because she was worried that the same thing would happen and that they wouldn't see him as the aggressor. We'll never know. We might know because her records might show that she did try to call 911, but without Gabby to tell us, we'll never know that. So, anyway, main officer tells Brian their stories were exactly the same. That's not true. Their stories were not exactly the same. And after this entire ordeal, no citation was given, which I'm sure both of them were super grateful about. But it was really such an ordeal. I mean, this whole thing, the back and forth and all over, like, it's quite the sight on the side of the road. And near the end, the only thing that bugged me was Gabby was told by this main officer, not the bearded one, that there was nothing to cry about. And the thing is she clearly felt there was a reason to be crying. So saying that there is no reason is actually really dismissive. But he is a cop, right? He's an officer. He's not there for her emotional needs. You know what I'm saying? But I'm only saying this and bringing this up for others who may be listening. Like, if somebody is crying, it's usually not the best to tell them that they have no reason to be crying or that they shouldn't cry, because you're basically saying that their crying is making you uncomfortable and you don't need to be doing that, and that you're dismissing their feelings, and that's not okay. Now, this officer, he's a cop. Cops usually don't, I've blubbered cops before. They don't care at all. These ones actually were nicer than most cops I've seen to a female who's crying. Okay? Because usually they don't care. I've tried, been there, done that, right? I know some of you ladies have too. So, overall, the takeaway for me is that the witness, who was very clear about what he saw, was left out of this entire equation, like completely left out. And I would love to hear from him. I'm sure would really like to hear from him and what he actually saw, since nobody called him. At least not that we see in any of the body cam footages. And if bearded officer called one witness, why wouldn't he have called the second witness? And at one point he says that later he's going to contact him, which probably means that he would get in contact with dispatch to get the 911 caller's information, and then either call him after the fact. But after the fact is kind of too late, right? Because if you took the time to call the one witness, why wouldn't you take the time to call the second witness in the moment before you come to the conclusion that she's the aggressor? And at the same time, why don't you go and actually listen to what Brian's saying instead of just assuming that you know what he's saying, or that only hearing parts of it and coming to the conclusion that he's the innocent one in all this? But that's that. So, the next one because this is an hour, I am going to do part 3, and part 3 will be about the new footage. So, that being said, all that I just said, again, why I'm not the hugest fan of this bearded guy. I think he seemed to be greatly controlling, but that could be because he was actually this other officer's boss. For all I know, I have no idea. 2, actually, I could probably look it up. You know what? I'm going to look it up. 2, I'm not blaming these officers in the sense that I don't hold them responsible for what happened to Gabby later. I don't think they killed her. I definitely don't think that, obviously. And the biggest thing for me here is this. I'm not going to bully these officers. I can express my opinion and how I view this, but there's no way that I'm going to bully them like so many people are trying to do. And, the public is pretty relentless when they start bullying. They will dox and go real life, and that's not cool. When you start doing that and you start getting into the territory of this officer possibly ending up killing himself, okay? We don't need to do that. We don't need to cause somebody so much grief and stress because we think we know that he was right or wrong to the point that he may take his life. And that's happened before in cases where somebody was doxed and people were just bullying and tormenting, okay? Everything that I said about this officer in this video right now, if he was in front of me, I would literally say to his face, I'd be like, bro, what the hell? Like, he could be sitting, I'm in my garage right now. There's a chair next to me right now. If he came in my house and he sat in that chair, I'd be like, all right, sit down, let's talk about this body cam footage. And I would go through, and I'd pause, and I'd be like, okay, you want to explain that to me? What the hell are you talking about? And he'd be like, blah, 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 blah. And I'd be like, oh, okay, that makes more sense. So, anything that I've said right here stays right here, and he's most likely not going to see this, because let's face it, I'm not a million viewer channel, right? He's not going to see this. So I can say this here, and I'm not harming him in any way. When you go real life, that's a different story. When you get to the point that you're so emotionally attached and you're saying you're so sure that everything he did and said was completely wrong, and you get so angry, and you're like looking up his wife and his kids and his address, and you're showing up to his home, that's not cool. Let's not do that, please, okay? If anything was wrong in this incident, they are doing an investigation from an independent team to look this over. If something was handled wrong, they'll find it. That's number one. Number two, Gabby's story may actually lead to change. They may actually start to handle these domestic incidences differently. And it usually starts with somebody's story that causes the change, right? Okay. Let's leave it in the hands of this investigation and possible down the line that protocols or laws are made in Gabby's name. It's not our responsibility to get all in a huff and go and destroy somebody else's life, okay? Enough lives have been destroyed because of what happened between Gabby and Brian. We don't need to add to the list of people whose lives lives that we destroy. No more lives need to be destroyed. Enough, right? So, again, I'm not here to crucify them or attack them. I'm really not. I just think that we really need to go over this because Gabby's not here to speak for herself. And I call this podcast Stillspeakpod, and I've explained several times now the reason for that is that it's often said that victims cannot speak, and I disagree because they actually speak to us through the evidence and the story and the blah, 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 blah. But if you want to know more, I talk about it in my first video on this channel ever, okay? This body cam footage is Gabby's way of speaking to us. It's just not verbally through words in the moment. This isn't, her telling us about this event from her mouth in this moment. But we can look at this video and we can get certain things from it that ends up speaking for her and tells a story of what may have led up to her death 15 to roughly 18 days later, right? Because we can't say that it's not connected. It absolutely is connected. Something else happened at some point, clearly, if Brian is the one who killed her. I mean, that's a given. So, I'm going to end there. I am going to do an update video, and in the update video, I only have one thing to talk about. Actually, I have 3 things to talk about. It's not a whole lot. It's nothing major. I'm also going to do an updated timeline with that update because there won't be much to talk about, so I'm going to do the timeline again because the last time I did it was on the 24th, and so that was about a week ago. So I'm going to do that, and I'm also going to tomorrow I'll have part 3 of the new footage and what I have to say about that one, and there'll be a lot because that one was more eye-opening than this one. And I am working on a few other stories and another edition of my Caitlin Connolly series at the same time, but I also am a mother to several children and I have a life, and so time. There's never enough time. Oop, just hit my mic, so that's my cue. Until next time.